All right, let's finish out here in the home stretch. Somebody wake up Jess there. She's sleeping. Sorry. We have our deep thought picture here. So what do you think? 2 Kings, right? 2 kings. And we have exile. See it? Exile. That's it. Get it?
You should post one of these on the discussion board and make us do a caption contest or something.
All right, I'll pick out one of the harder ones, right? All right, well, let's take a look at 2 Kings. We're making the transition to 2 Kings. Here we go. So right away we see the encounter with Elijah, between Elijah and the son of Ahab, Ahaziah, in chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Let's see here. Young, where are you? Not here? She's not here. All right. How about Grace? How about you? Could you read for us the first 4 verses? Chapter 1.
Now Moab rebelled against Israel after the death of Ahab and
Ahaziah?
fell through the upper chamber and became ill. So he sent messengers and said to them, "Go, inquire of
Baal-Zevuv. Zevuv.
the God of Ekron, whether I will recover from this sickness." But the angel of the Lord said to Elijah the Tishbite, "Arise, go up to meet the messengers. Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Baal-Zevuv, God of Ekron? Now therefore, thus says the Lord, you shall not come down from the bed where you have gone up, but you shall surely die." Then Elijah departed.
So in response to the message from these messengers, Ahaziah asked about the kind of man that they encountered, and they respond in verse 8. They answered him, "He was a hairy man with a leather girdle about his loins," and he said, "It is Elijah the Tishbite." It seems, though, that the Lord has another answer to the king's question, and after 3 rounds here, we have Elijah is going to be confirmed not just as a hairy man from Tishbite, but as a man of God, and over in verse 13. So he again sent the captain of the third 50 with his 50, and when the third captain of the 50 went up, he came up and bowed down on his knees before Elijah and begged him and said to him, "O man of God, please let my life and the lives of these 50 servants of yours be precious in your sight." So Ahaziah dies according to the words of Elijah. We see that in verse 17. So Ahaziah died according to the word of the Lord, which Elijah had spoken, and because he had no son, Jehoram became king in his place in the 2nd year of Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. So he passes his mantle on to Elisha. After that, Elijah is taken up to be with the Lord. And in the famous passage there in chapter 2, verse 11, we see it came about as they were going along and talking that, behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, which separated the 2 of them, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind to heaven. So it's an important emphasis. After that, we have verse 23. An important, I don't know, we have to go. It's just kind of just a quick reminder that you're not supposed to be mocking God. Verse 23, he came up from there to Bethel, and as he was going up by the way, young lads came out from the city and mocked him, Elisha, and said to him, "Go up, you bald head, go up, you bald head." And when he looked, behold, behind him he saw them. He cursed them in the name of Yahweh. Then 2 female bears came out of the woods and tore up 42 lads of their number. And he went from there to Mount Carmel, and from there he returned to Samaria. So you don't want to mess with Elisha, especially in mocking the Lord that he represents. We're going to see this start to pick up. The ministry of Elisha is going to be significant on the early part of Elisha. It's like pretend he's dropped right in the middle of the book of Judges. You know, there's this spiritual chaos going on all around him. It's a world turned upside down. And Elisha here early on in his ministry is going to encounter a widow, one whose husband was among the sons of the prophets, interestingly. She's in debt and in fear of losing her 2 children to slavery as payment for the debt. So we pick up this scenario in chapter 4, verse 1, the famous widow's oil account or narrative. Let's see here. Now I'm going to ask Jess to read in chapter 4, verse 1. Go ahead there.
Up to what?
Just verse 1 for now.
Now a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets carried out to Elijah, your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant fears the Lord, and the creditor has come to take my 2 children to be his slave.
Okay, you got it. So 25, I'm sorry, you don't have to turn there, but we need to remind ourselves that this kind of scenario should not be happening within a covenant community. You know, remind ourselves because we have Leviticus 25. If you want to turn there, you can. But Leviticus 25, starting in verse 39, Moses had taught, if a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to you that he sells himself to you, you shall not subject him to a slave service. He shall be with you as a hired man, as if he were a sojourner with you until the year of Jubilee. Of course, that's when he's able to be set free. He shall then go out from you, he and his sons with him shall go back to his family, that he may return to the property of his forefathers. So this is not what Israel ought to be doing and taking advantage, right, of the poor or anybody who owes money is turning their children into slaves. This ought not be happening. So there's a lot of opposition that is, with regards to the ministry of Elisha and what he's trying to do. So he talks in response here. He responds to the widow in chapter 4. Keep reading there, Jess, in verse 2 down through verse 7. Thanks.
And Elisha said to her, what shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house? And she said, your maidservant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil. And he said, go borrow vessels at large for yourself from all your neighbors, even empty vessels. Do not get a few. And you shall go in and shut the door behind you and your sons, and pour out into all these vessels, and you shall set aside what is full. When she went from him and shut the door behind her and her sons, they were bringing the vessels to her, and she poured. As it came about when the vessels were full, that she said to her son, bring me another vessel. And he said to her, there is not one vessel more. And the oil stopped. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, go sell the oil and pay your debt, and your sons can live on the rest.
So it's interesting these miracles start coming about. We've seen them before with the ministry of Elijah. Now they continue on with Elisha, this baton of the authentication ministry of the name of Yahweh. So now we've got Yahweh on the move, and in small little scenarios scattered around, there's these kinds of miracles showing up or occurring that validate and authenticate the name and reputation of Yahweh amongst his people. So this might be a ministry here, you might say, behind the scenes ministry to the faithful remnant that we have going on here. Here, there's a provision here of provision for this household that's struggling financially. And just right around the corner, we see another encounter with this woman from Shunem, the Shunammite woman. She and her husband of old age have no son. We know that's a crisis for a household and the preservation of the household and its name. There's no firstborn son. There's no one to take over the household upon the death of her husband. So this is another tragic scenario that we have. But Elijah here predicts otherwise. And he steps in the situation of the Shunammite woman. We see his prediction in verse 16 and 17. When he finds all of this out, at the season next year, you shall embrace a son. And she said, no, my lord, O man of God, do not lie to your maidservant. You know how old my husband is. And the woman conceived and bore a son at that season next year, just as Elijah had said to her. So there's not a lot of details given, but there's yet another miracle. miracle being God's working behind the scenes to provide here miraculously for a couple who couldn't normally be able to produce a son because of the old age of the father. But what happens is we have a part 2. The same boy will later tragically become ill and die. Have we seen this scenario before, right? Another tragic situation. He dies in the arms of his mother, and we have the details in chapter 4, verse 18. When the child was grown, the day came that he went out to his father, to the reapers, to help in the field, right? And he says to his father, my head, my head. I almost started crying there. Have you ever had a child come crying to you, complaining about something hurting, pain? That always, it's an alarm for any parent, right? When it happens like that, we see your child in pain. And he says to his servant, he said to his servant, carry him to his mother. And when he had taken him and brought him to his mother, he sat on her lap until noon, and then he died. And she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God and shut the door behind him and went out. So we've got this tragedy. But again, Elisha interrupts this tragic situation with yet another miracle. Skip down to verse 32 in chapter 4. When Elisha came into the house, behold, the lad was dead and on his bed. He enters, shuts the door behind them both, and prayed to Yahweh. And he went up and lay on the child, put his mouth on his mouth, eyes on his eyes, hands on his hands. I don't know why the details are there, but it's just stretched himself on top of the kid. The flesh of the child became warm. Then he returned and walked into the house once back and forth and went up and stretched himself on him. And the lad sneezed 7 times, which is the perfect number. And the lad opened his eyes, and there he was. Call the Shunammite. So he called her, and when she came in to him, he said, take up your son. And, needless to say, so she went in and fell at his feet and bowed herself to the ground, and she took up her son and went out. So again, here, a miracle of a resurrection of a child is now the word's going to get out and authenticate the name of Yahweh in the midst of this surrounding pagan chaos, right, where there's spiritual confusion. So again, as if that was enough, Elisha seems to save the best for last. We have another miracle with regards to Naaman, and the commander of the Aramean army, interestingly, now under King Ben-Hadad II during the reign of the Israelite king Joram. And the problem that we have for Naaman here, the captain, in verse 1, is that he has leprosy. Let's see here. Thomas, could you read for us in chapter 5, verse 1?
Naaman, captain of the army of the king of Aram, was a great man with his master and highly respected, because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram. The man was also a valiant warrior, but he was a leper.
So that's the problem. We've seen problems before for Elisha, and interestingly, what we have a little bit later on, of all things, an Israelite servant girl working for Ben-Hadad's wife. Now here we have the king of the Aramean nation, his wife, and an Israelite servant girl who had been taken in, announces that there's a prophet back home in Israel who she's heard has the ability to bring about these kinds of necessary miracles. So this, pagan king, Ben-Hadad, sends a letter to the king of the King Joram, chapter 5, verses 6 through 7. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, and now as this letter comes to you, behold, I have sent Naaman, my servant, to you, that you may cure him of leprosy. And it came about when the king of Israel read the letter that he tore his clothes and said, am I God to kill, to make alive, that this man is sending word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? But consider now and see that he is seeking a quarrel against me. This is some kind of trick. But Elisha hears of the request, and he steps in, and he brings about healing for Naaman. In chapter 5, verse 10 and 11, Naaman was furious and went away and said, behold, I thought he would surely come out to me, that is the prophet, and stand and call in the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Avana and Parpah, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in rage. Is that what I wanted to read? Verse 10 through 11, and then verse 14. So he went down finally and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan River, according to the word of the man of God, Elisha, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. So again, we have another miracle that authenticates the name and reputation of the Lord. So the prophets, like Elisha, like Elijah, and like the prophets who come later, there's going to be lots of opposition that comes around. And in a rage, I'll come back to you in just a second. We see that Ben-Hadad, the Aramean king, sends an army and surrounds the city of Dothan, surrounding Elisha inside. So he's on the inside of the city where Elisha is staying. And the king here, in this particular case, wants the prophet dead. 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 11 through 14. Let's see, could we have Wes over here? Could you read for us? Chapter 6, verse 11 through 14. Got it? Weston. I didn't call you. I'm sorry. I should have called you Weston.
Oh, no, you're good.
Okay.
All right, verse 11 through 14?
Yep.
All right. The king of Aram was enraged because of this matter, and he called his servants and demanded of them, "Tell me, which one of us is for the king of Israel?" One of his servants said, "No one, my lord, the king Elisha, the prophet in Israel, tells the king of Israel even the words you speak in your bedroom." So the king said, "Go and see where he is, so I can send men to capture him." When he was told Elisha is in Dothan, he sent chariots and a massive army there. They went by night and surrounded the city.
And we think that's the end, right? You're surrounded. There's a bigger army on the outside. They're coming after you. But there's more going on. And here's a great glimpse into the unseen spiritual battle, verses 15 down through verse 17. Keep reading there, Weston.
When the servant of the man of God got up early and went out, he discovered an army with horses and chariots surrounding the city. So he asked Elisha, "Oh, my master, what are we to do?"
Hide. Run. Give up. No. Keep going.
Elisha said, "Don't be afraid, for those who are with us outnumber those who are with them." Then Elisha prayed, "Lord, please open his eyes and let him see." So the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw that the mountain was covered with horses and chariots on fire.
Chariots of fire. Chariots of fire or on fire?
Of fire, excuse me.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't know they were on. Well, I guess technically they're on fire if they're of fire. So, yeah, it's the inspiration behind the famous movie Chariots of Fire, coming from the biblical reference here. But it's a great picture of the prophets who know full well who's fighting the battle, right? The spiritual battle. It's interesting that prophets have a beeline in seeing the unseen spiritual battle, and the fact that here it's the Lord's army that, and I'm not, making this, a spiritually motivated scene out of Lord of Rings, but I love this scene. Sorry, not that one, but this one. I love this scene. There's the enemy. I can't remember which segment this was, which one in the trilogy this was. Return of the King? Yeah. There's Elijah and his servants, outnumbered, or so we think. All right, there we go. Okay, Mark, you had a question. Yeah.
About Naaman's leprosy and the widow.
Those two accounts?
Yeah.
Okay.
Specifically mentioned by Jesus when he starts his ministry in Nazareth. He goes to the synagogue on the Sabbath, and there's scrolls of Isaiah, and then they're like, "Who is this guy?" He mentions these two specific accounts, and it angers them so much that they want to kill him now. like after he makes that speech, why are the first century Israelites and the Jews so offended by him telling these two stories?
Oh my.
Like, he could have picked any two stories, but they get so offended by it.
Remind me if the context in the New Testament was Jesus healing on the Sabbath?
No, he went to the synagogue, unrolled the scroll of Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He gave it back to the attendant. He said, today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. And they said, isn't this the son of Joseph? And he says, doubtless he will quote me on this proverb, physician, heal yourself. And then he goes and tells, weren't there many widows in the days of Elijah? And then wasn't Naaman the Syrian healed with Elijah the prophet? And it says, when they heard these things, the synagogue was filled with wrath. They rose up, drove him out of the town, brought him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they could throw him down the cliff, but passing through the midst of the night.
So that's when Jesus is choosing, or is not healing people who are coming.
Yeah.
That's why it says.
But this is like the beginning of his ministry in
Yeah.
this account. Like, he hasn't done anything but the temptation. He rolls into his hometown, it's like,
they start to, I think that says they start to doubt, they start to say, isn't this the carpenter's son?
Yeah, he's authenticating who he is, right? As
yeah.
the Messiah, as God.
But he chooses always two stories.
Yeah. Well, maybe, yeah. It's like on the spot. You New Testament scholars need to work all this out, with your New Testament class. Who else? You guys are in this New Testament class too? Who else was in this New Testament class?
Testament 3, we won't cover that part.
Won't cover that part, Rats, New Testament 1. It seems I'd make, it's probably along the lines of just as Elisha is authenticating the name of the Lord, and not that he's obviously not the incarnate Messiah, God, Messiah, but he's representing God at that context. Maybe Jesus is picking up, now I'm stepping into a similar role, everybody, and you're not going to like it, but guess who else has the power to bring about this kind of miracle? Like that? Does that make a little bit of sense? You were going to comment on something? Oh, I thought, listen, yes.
That test is part of a messianic test.
Yeah, sure.
So the people at the synagogue know that test addresses Messiah.
Yeah.
So Jesus now is possessing himself as the Messiah.
Well, yeah.
So and they don't accept him as the Messiah.
No, not at first, right?
So the next thing is to kill him, to throw him off.
False claim.
So
false prophet, right.
So Jesus just referred to the Old Testament for them about what happened, but they are reacting on the book of Isaiah that said this scripture has now come to fulfillment in your hearing.
Okay.
So he's claiming to them that I am the Messiah.
I'm the God who brought,
That's not what makes him mad, because it says they marveled at his gracious words. Then he tells of him and the widow, and then they're angered by that.
So they were buying political refuge and not to be completely healed, what Jesus came to do. So when he said, I'm healed of leprosy and do all that stuff, they were thinking that he would politically liberate them instead of just, and then he's just like, okay, you guys are really just looking at the small picture. Yes, if you want liberation, it'll come, but and then then they thought it was blasphemous as well.
Student online just points out that the reference was more about Jesus extending grace to the Gentiles as well. So
healing non-Jews, right? Is that what you said? Yeah.
Non-Jews.
Okay, right. Yeah. Interesting. Well, there's might be a kind of a intersection of a few things going on there that may have provoked.
Offended as something that happened 1,000 years before, though. He could have addressed something very recent, towards the beginning, or with Moses, who picked up a guy 1,000 years ago. two guys.
Yeah. Well, but I don't think I have to. It's speculation, but maybe something. Maybe there would have been. Maybe the Jews in that particular context may have had some kind of, priestly focus on that as in a teaching series recently or something. Maybe Jesus knew to bring that up to kind of get their attention at that time. I don't know. That's just speculation. Now we're going to hear from the source of truth. I'm just kidding. You got the definitive answer on this? Go ahead.
I think it's just a theme of God's people rejecting him. That in 1st and 2nd Kings, we have repeated instances where God's people reject him.
Sure.
Here again, they are not accepting God's prophet. And God is limited in what he can do with Israel because of their rejection. So just as Elisha had to do ministry outside of Israel because of their rejection, Jesus Christ will also be available for ministry to non-Jews.
What do you think of that? There's another layer. I like that.
I mean, I'm thinking of my time, but this happens 1,000 years before, and it cuts into the quick, you know.
Okay. Well, let's keep moving here a little bit as we finish out the home stretch here. We okay?
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, good discussion. I like that. Might turn it into a extra credit discussion or something. So we're going to see Elisha's ministry continue to advance and intersect with the political situation with the Arameans. And we see now that Ben-Hadad is sick, and he sends his official Hazael to ask of Elisha details, right, of whether he'll recover or not. We see that in 2 Kings. We move over now to chapter 8, verses 7 down through 8. Elisha, he comes to Damascus in verse 7. Now Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, was sick, and it was told him, saying, the man of God is come here. And the king says to Hazael, take a gift in your hand and go to meet the man of God and inquire of the Lord, saying, quote, will I recover from this sickness? So that's what we have. Elisha is going to respond to this question. Interestingly, in verse 10, Elisha says to him, go say to him, quote, you shall surely recover, but the Lord has shown me that he will certainly die. So there's a little bit of ambiguity there, maybe a little bit of sarcasm perhaps. The words of promised recovery are reserved for the king. However, Elisha's secret message to Hazael is that the king will surely die. So you see the quoted part goes to the king, but what Elisha says directly to the messenger, but he's going to die. So, there's a little bit of, it's interesting in a little bit. So maybe as a result of feeling a little guilty and perhaps a little bit under pressure, knowing the reality of this evil king left unchecked, we see the emotional side of Elisha down in verse 11 and 12. It's interesting. And he fixed his gaze steadily on him until he was ashamed. And then the man of God wept. And Hazael says, why does my Lord weep? And then Elisha answered, because I know the evil that you will do to the sons of Israel. Their strongholds you will set on fire, and their young men you will kill with the sword, and their little ones you will dash in pieces, and their women with child you will rip up. Man, talk about intense. So what's going on here? We're just going to pause a little bit about this and look at this. What happens? So he predicts the kingship here of Hazael in verse 13. But what is your servant who is but a dog that he should do this great thing? Hazael asks, and Elisha answers, the Lord has shown me that you will be king over Aram, over the Arameans. So that's verse 13. And then verse 15, it comes about on the morrow, the next day, that he took the cover and dipped it in water and spread it on his face so that he died. And Hazael became king in his place. So that's the murder by suffocation that we see in the picture here. Tried to make just kind of light of it, but it's not really that funny if you think about it. So what we need to do is look at some things here. I want to look back at verse 12 a little bit. Some of the details that we have in this prophetic prediction, right? This prophecy with regards to King Hazael, the next king in Aram. Verse 12. In this particular language, the references, the kind of the violent references and the violence here, you might say crimes of war, crimes against humanity with regards to little ones and pregnant women. So these are war crimes. you might think. We have another prophet who announces judgment against the Arameans, referencing similar language. Let's turn to the prophet Amos. We're going to play a little bit of some Bible jumping around now. Remember, Amos was a prophet active to Israel and the northern nations, to the northern nation Israel. Amos and Hosea and Jonah are all prophets. Sorry, here we go. So we're in the book of Amos. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way here. Amos chapter 1. I officiated a wedding on Saturday, so I'm still not recovered. That's my excuse. So Amos, in the first part of his prophetic book, he brings judgment against some of the nations in and around Israel. So interestingly, he brings a judgment against the Arameans here in chapter 1, beginning in verse 3. So let's look at this in chapter 1, verse 3 of Amos. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, capital city of the Arameans, and for 4, I will not revoke its punishment. So, because they threshed Gilead with implements of sharp iron, so I'll send fire upon the house of Hazael, there we go, right, the king, and it will consume the citadels of Ben-Hadad, the former king, and I'll break the gate bar of Damascus, the capital city, and cut off the inhabitant from the valley of Avon, and he who holds the scepter, that is the king, from Beth Eden. So the people of Aram, the Arameans, will go exiled to Kir. So we've got this description again, and we ask ourselves, what is going on here? Why this language? And in this case of the prophet Amos, we have in verse 3, the end there, they threshed Gilead with implements of sharp iron. And if I go back to verse 12 in 2 Kings 8, dashed, killed with a sword, and their little ones dashed in pieces, and their women, the pregnant women with child will be ripped up. What in the world? So we're kind of making some connections here. Let's turn to 2 Kings chapter 10 and jump ahead a little bit in verse 32. 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 32, and we have now ongoing, this is a recounting of a later invasion of Syria under the leadership of King Hazael against the Israelite king Jehu. So in 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 32 and 33, in those days the Lord began to cut off portions from Israel. So judgment against Israel through the hand of Hazael. So Hazael defeats them throughout the territory of Israel. From the Jordan eastward, all the land of Gilead, so that's one of the pieces that comes from Amos, and the Gadites and the Reubenites and the Manassites from Aror, which is by the valley of the Arnon, even Gilead and Bashan. So this is the conflict that Amos is referring to in his prophecy. We also have 2 Kings chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. And let's see. That's another conflict that we have with regards to, we won't read the whole text, but 13 verses 1 through 7 talk about the conflict with Jehoahaz during the period, their conflicts against King Jehu, with King Jehu and Jehoahaz. All right, so where am I going with all this? So 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 33 references the Jordan eastward and all the land of Gilead. And Gilead refers to a 60-mile area where northern tribes of Gad and Reuben settled between the Aramean tribes and Israel. Now, I'm going to answer my question. So here we go. The author of Kings is leaving us with details of the battles. He's talking about the Arameans against the Israelites. And we heard now from Amos, so we have 2 prophets speaking against the Arameans with regards to specific things that happen on the battlefield. And we recall verse 12 in chapter 8 of 2 Kings. Chapter 8 and verse 12, with referencing to the young children and the women being ripped to pieces. So Amos is screaming off the page in his judgment against the Arameans. In chapter 1, verses 3 through 4, we read that. And Amos specifically refers to with instruments of sharp iron. So what we have in the ancient world is this picture. So this is an agricultural practice with regards to taking boards, turning them into half-pipe boards, surfboards, a little bit broader, and pounding in sharp metal or sharp rocks on the bottom, just like you have there, and then taking them out on the wheat fields as kind of a precursor step to wheat harvest. As a way of kind of breaking up the wheat and shredding it and starting the process of separating wheat from the chaff. Does that make sense? So could it be that the Arameans, under the leadership of King Hazazel, did exactly what Elisha warned against? What if they threshed the battlefield, not the wheat field, with instruments like this, and took advantage of the poor and the needy and the defenseless with their cruelty and in their crimes against humanity, which Amos is railing against in his charge against the Arameans that comes later in history, looking back on these atrocities that occurred. So it's interesting, we have Prophet A looking forward and warning against, and we have Prophet B looking back on the evidence and bringing that in his charge against the Arameans from the divine vantage point. So it's an interesting connection. I think what we have going on here is a war crime against humanity. This is whatever they did with those instruments here on the battlefield was an atrocity, and that's, I think, what might be going on here. And we get a little glimpse into how the Lord feels about all of humanity. Again, the value of humanity, regardless of what country of origin they're from. And we have again a case not like what we saw a couple weeks ago with innocents' lives being taken, with regards to in this case, the Arameans bringing judgment against the Israelites. So this is truly the spirit of paganism, I think, applied on the battlefield. What do pagans do, and how do they regard human life when the battle is when the victory is on their side? So we'll see cases of this when we get to the prophets, where the Lord has something to say against these nations with regards to their brutality, especially when we get to the Assyrians. They're going to be the most brutal of all of the nations with regards to the exile that happens against Israel. And the Lord will have the last word against that. So, all right, that's what we have here. And but Elisha's not done. We see Elisha and this group of prophets. They're going to go find Jehu, just like he was commanded to do. And Elisha will appoint Jehu as king over Israel as a means of, in this case, bringing judgment against the house of Ahab. Ahab's dead, but he has a household. We have 2 Kings chapter 9. Let's move ahead. In verses 1 through 3, now Elisha the prophet called one of the sons of the prophets and said to him, gird up your loins, which means put on your swords, and take the flask of oil in your hand and go to Ramoth Gilead. When you arrive, search out Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi, and go in and bid him arise from among his brothers and bring him to the inner room. Take the flask of oil, pour it out on his head, and say, quote, thus says the Lord, I've anointed you king over Israel. Then open the door and flee and do not wait. So you're going to stir up a hornet's nest with this one. And in verses 7 through 10, you shall strike the house of Ahab. So what will Jehu do? You'll strike the house of Ahab, your master, that I may avenge the blood of my servants, the prophets, and the blood of all the servants of the Lord at the hand of Jezebel. For the whole house of Ahab shall perish. I'll cut off from Ahab every male person in both bond and free in Israel. I'll make the house of Ahab like the house of Jeroboam the first, the son of Nevat, like the house of Baasha, the son of Ahijah. And the dog shall eat Jezebel in the territory of Jezreel, and none shall bury her. Then he opened the door and fled. So this is going to become a pretty graphic situation. Jehu served as the military commander of the northern king Ahab. And we'll learn that from 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 5 and 25. What's interesting, here we have a picture on what's called the Black Obelisk. This is from the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III. We see the phrase where he's paying tribute, Jehu, son of Omri. And here he is paying tribute. What's interesting is that this Assyrian, what's called a black obelisk or stela, mentions that Jehu is a son of Omri. But we have from the biblical account that we just read is Jehu is one of the 7 children of King Jehoshaphat, right? Or the grandson of Nimshi. But this is explained because, not a contradiction, we understand in the Assyrian mind, to them to say son of Omri is the same thing as saying from Israel. Remember I said Omri was one of these celebrity kings of Israel, the northern nation. So they're just recognizing that, he's just one more king from Israel, from the household, from the house or the dynasty, in this case, of Omri. So I think that's what's going on here. Omri was one of the best-known Israelite kings, known to the outside world, and here we have evidence of that here in the Assyrian king Shalmaneser. So now the Lord's bringing judgment against this dynasty. Jehu's reign of terror begins, and I won't read the text because it's pretty graphic. I'm just going to tell you what happens, and then we'll end this slide and go on for the day because you've been so well behaved. He'll begin. Jehu, what does he do? He assassinates Jehoram or Joram, king of Israel, and he follows here again the line from Omri all the way down to Ahab. Ahaziah and Joram. So that's all in chapter 9, verse 21 through 24. Then Jehu assassinates the king of Judah, Ahaziah. That's in chapter 9, verses 27 through 28. Then Jehu goes after Jezebel, who must have known that something was coming. Chapter 9, verse 30 through 32. Let's just end with that because we're waiting for her end. Jezebel, she is slain in verses 30. She says, when Jehu came to Jezreel, Jezebel heard of it. She painted her eyes and adorned her head, which is what you do typically when you know your end is near. Put on your makeup. She looks out the window, and as Jehu enters the gate, she says, is it well, Zimri, your master's murderer? And then he lifted up his face to the window and said, who is on my side? Who? And 2 or 3 officials looked down at him, and he said, throw her down. So they threw her down, and some of her blood was sprinkled on the wall, on the horses, and he trampled underfoot. He trampled her underfoot, and he came in and ate and drank, and he said, see now to this cursed woman, bury her, for she's a king's daughter. And they went to bury her, but they found no more of her than her skull and the feet and the palms of her hands. And there's dogs involved, right? We know the end of that story. So you see that in verse 36. The author spares no details of this grisly death of Jezebel in fulfillment of the prophecy that came earlier. So we'll end today, sorry, with such a gruesome situation, but we'll come back and finish 2 Kings and get into the wisdom books next week, all right? We're a little behind according to where we are in the quiz, so don't be alarmed. That's okay. We'll eventually catch back up, so don't worry. So.